Welcome to the webinar on the art of a questioning network. And in this particular webinar, it really is a representative of the third part of the PRISM process, the part that is about identifying the signs of vitality. The first part is about identifying the signs of vitality and vibrancy of the association or the network. The second part of the process is really about assisting the association of churches in developing a shared language, really to be able to describe their collective mission as a regional family of churches, to be able to develop and put together some measures by which they can evaluate, hey, when are we winning at accomplishing the mission of an association? And the strategies, what are the values for vehicle delivery for our family of churches? And the part that we're stepping into today is the third part of the PRISM process, and it's where we are working to equip leaders with some of the core competencies to help upgrade the DNA of the association. And whenever I say DNA, what I mean is discovering next approach. And the idea is we want to help the association assist churches to discover their next best step towards meaningful progress in their context. And so, through these competencies of this third phase, really we're helping to equip the leaders of the association with ways in which they can help those churches do that through either making a map by which they can say, hey, this is how I accomplish my best next step, or deciding what type of guide they need for their church and being able to evaluate that for them, being able to decide on what that next step looks like. And our desire through the entire PRISM process is really to assist associations and networks to develop ways in which they can allow the Spirit of God really to pull a congregation or a pastor into their future instead of simply developing ways in which they push congregations into the future. Over and over again, what I hear from associational leaders is this, attitude of we want to serve churches, but then as they're expressing this desire to serve churches, they start talking about getting them to attend the particular events that they're going to attend, or helping them to, implement some mission strategy that they want to do. And so it's not so much the association supporting and strengthening the churches as it is the association really trying to get the churches to support and strengthen what it is the association is doing. And so we want to shift that paradigm a little bit and have this approach of saying, how can we begin to think in ways by which we help the congregations and the pastors be pulled by the Spirit of God into the future? Now, some of you may be familiar with that type of terminology, and some of you may not. But what I'd like to do is I want to reference a passage of scripture, and it's from Matthew 14:22. And you know the passage of scripture. It's where Jesus has just gotten through teaching, and he's made his disciples get into the boat, and he says, I want you to go ahead and go on to the other side, and I'm going to dismiss the crowds. And so they get in the boat and they begin to make their way out. Jesus dismisses the crowds, and you know the rest of the story. Jesus went up on the mountainside to pray, and his disciples proceeded to face a storm. And as they were facing that storm, we know that Jesus walked out and they freaked out. They thought it was a ghost. And, Peter was like, wow, is this you, Jesus? And then he stepped out on the water. But the reality is that Jesus knew what was going to take place when he told them to get in that boat. God knows perfectly in 800K clarity, even more so. He knows yesterday, today, and tomorrow with perfect clarity. And he told them to go across the sea. So he knew that He was going to be setting them up for a moment where their faith was going to be tested, but he sent them anyway. And in doing so, the way that I like to think about that, it was almost like Jesus is already there in that moment, and he is pulling them into a future that they couldn't see yet. And it was their willingness to be obedient, to move forward, that they began a journey that only God knew the ending to. And so we want to help associations assist churches and pastors really to begin a journey that they don't know the ending to, but that God does, and that they are being pulled forward into something bigger, bigger than themselves, bigger than their church, bigger than their pastorate, but ultimately being pulled forward because they're captured by this enormity of God. And so they're willing to step out and step into something that's better, even though they don't know what that better is in its entirety. And and I believe firmly that questions and asking questions is a great way to assist in that process. Our one of our friends and colleagues, Jessie Cruikshank, she often makes this statement, and it stood out in my mind ever since she made it. She says, "The only another person can help you know what you almost know. Only another person can help you know what you almost know." And as an associational leader, you're uniquely positioned really to help others know what it is that they almost know. And you're able to do this by asking questions, and asking questions that ultimately allow the Spirit of God to unleash opportunities, really to see things in a new way. The ability to be able to ask questions, it's always been important to relationship building, but in our culture today, it's even more important because people want to know that you emotionally care for them before they'll ever consider giving significantly of their time to you. And questions are a great way to do that. So, as we get started today, as we think about Jesus pulling us into the future, I want to open this up in a word of prayer. And then I want us to begin to ask some questions. So, let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for these leaders. Thank you for these leaders taking the time. I appreciate that. Their time is valuable. And so, God, is my hope and my prayer that they would walk away with this time feeling enriched, that they would walk away feeling encouraged, but also that they would walk away with more tools that are going to help them as they seek to bring greater value to the churches that they serve and the pastors that they have opportunity to serve. God, may we be vision casters, not of our vision, but may we be vision casters of your vision. Vision casters who say, man, God can do beyond what we can ask or think. And so, wouldn't it be incredible if we begin to live that way? If we begin to pastor our churches that way? If we begin to carry out our worship that way? And I pray that you would encourage these leaders as they seek to encourage others to begin thinking in so much bigger terms and capacities than just their area of ministry, but they would be thinking in the capacity of the future in which you are pulling them into. God, I pray that you would be magnified in and through it all, and we ask these things in your precious Son's name. Amen. Now, before we get too deep into the content, what I want to do is both of you guys have had a lot of experience. You know, you should be able to remember your name, Steve. This is Steve, and Steve, and you're still in Virginia, right, Steve?
Yes.
And Steve Doyle's in Texas, and you guys have got a lot of experience and a lot of time in ministry under your belt. But what I want you to do is I want you to take about 5 minutes, and I want you to draft the 3 questions you ask every pastor when you sit down with them for the first time. What are the three questions that you ask every single pastor when you sit down for them for the first time? So I'm going to give you just a few minutes to be able to do that. It may take you less time. You may already have those in your mind and you say, oh, that's easy. I can knock those right out. But what are the three questions that you're going to ask a pastor every single time whenever you sit down with them for the first time? All right. So asked you, to draft those few questions that you're asking every single pastor. So now I'd love to hear those questions. What are the three questions that you ask every single pastor whenever you sit down with them for the first time?
Do you want to go first, Steve, or should I?
Go ahead.
By the way, Steve, I'm Steve Allsbrook.
Good to meet you.
I'm the
Steve
interim.
Doyle.
I'm the interim exec in Richmond. They got me out of retirement for a couple of months, but anyway.
All right.
First question I always talk to them about is their calendar. I say your calendar's as clear as it's ever going to be, and I want to know what you're going to do to experiment with how you go about learning what you're going to do and do differently maybe than you've done before if you've got experience, and if not, what mistakes you would like to leave room for and surprises where God can surprise you and things like that. So I'm looking at uh, asking about how they fill up their calendar or not and what they choose to do with it. That general area of questioning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my first question, if it's the first time I'm meeting a pastor, is I just ask them, "What's your story?" I want to hear their story, their ministry story, their family story. Just what's your story? Number two is what is the one thing your church is best at? What's the one thing your church is best at? Because I want to hear them tell me where they think they're strong, and then lastly, what ways can I best serve you?
Now, here we're going to get into the psychology of these questions. So, why? How did these questions, I guess not why, but how did those questions um, help you, but also how do those questions help the pastor?
In my particular case, I've had a number of pastors who say, I hadn't really thought about having research and development time and how I measure my 168 hours in a week and things of that nature. That first question goes to where they put their priorities. I didn't get you to my other two questions, but one of them has to do with what prior experience they've had in other associations, if any.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Several of the pastors who would come to us said, I've never been in an association like this one before. Uh, they're,
Bad.
uh, in our case, it was to our advantage and theirs that they showed up in our place.
Good.
The associations where they had served were either not as well uh, equipped or not as active, or uh, they just were not familiar with an association that worked like ours did,
Mm-hmm.
which was we supported our ministers in a number of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So
And what was that third question?
uh, the I'm looking in the area of accountability. I'll give you the Steve Allsberg ordination question, and then I'll tell you how that plays out in speaking to a minister like this. The question is, given what you know about yourself, 5 or 10 years from now, if I hear that you've screwed up in ministry, do you know what area that would be in, and what are you doing to guard against that? And my area of questioning for the new minister is, do you have any accountability partners? Because we'd like to introduce you to a group of other ministers who would like to get to know you and offer you that service as well. So
Mhm.
that's the particular piece.
Okay.
So
And so Steve Doyle or Olsbrook, you know, how do those questions really help that pastor in their context? I know you kind of answered a little bit about that, asking about, giving them the opportunity to prioritize, is there accountability? But what about Steve Doyle? What about you? Your questions, how do those help a pastor as they begin
Um,
thinking?
well, I guess the first one on the what is your story? I hope my desire is that that will help them open up
Mhm,
and to know that I'm a safe place, that I'm a safe person for them to share their story with.
mhm,
So I want them to feel that safety, but also to have that opportunity to be open. Some immediately jump in and tell you their whole story and all the chapters, and others will just kind of give you the cover, won't tell you very much. And then on the second one, what's the one thing your church is best at? I want to help them see how God is at work in their church. I
mhm,
think a lot of times we just focus on what's not working,
mhm,
and a lot of times pastors come to the association when they need help with something that's not working. Well, I want to know what is working, and then from my side, it helps me identify what my different churches are good at. So when I need a resource, say if I have a church that's really strong in evangelism, they say, "Hey, that's what we're best at." Then I'm going to go to them to help do a training.
mhm.
And then the last question, what ways can I best serve you? My desire there is just for them to know that I'm here to serve them, and that nothing's off the table. However I can help, I'll help.
Okay. I mean, those are all great questions, and I love them all. And I think that those are all helpful, and there's nothing wrong with any of those questions. And my only encouragement or question, um, in those questions, um, how are you giving those pastors in those questions really an opportunity to begin to dream, even in those introductory questions, to begin to dream and to think bigger?
Mm.
And the reason why I say that is because, at least in my experience, by giving a pastor or by giving a leader the opportunity to dream and inviting them into that, they all of a sudden start to open up in new ways. They start to open up in new ways, and you see a different side of them. They're not just talking about their present circumstance. They're not just talking about their present, struggles. But now you're starting to get to see what drives this pastor, and what is it long term that he wants to see take place in his context, that he wants to see from his life, that he wants to see God accomplish. And usually from those conversations, they walk away and they're like, man, I had an opportunity to dream. I met with an associational leader not too long ago via Zoom, and oftentimes, um, in our excitement, we can get all excited about what it is that we offer and what it is that we do. And this associational leader, he was brand new on the job, and there can be a tendency to lead with some agenda. We always have our agenda in the back of our mind. What can the association do for you, and that sort of thing. And so as I was speaking to him, he told me, he said, "Yeah, I'm going out to lunch with a lead pastor of a mega church um, after this conversation." And I said, "Oh, okay, really?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "So what do you plan to talk to him about?" This guy's been on the job 2 weeks as an AMS. He's just stepping into this role. He served as a senior pastor. He's probably in his early 40s. And he said, "You know what? I want to learn more about his church." So that's first of all, I want to hear more about his church. I want to hear more about him. I said, okay, yeah, that sounds good. And then he said, and then I want to be able to share with him why it's important that his church and churches like his continue to support the association. And I just sat there a little bit disappointed. And I had the opportunity to talk to him a little bit more afterward in detail, and kind of give him some counsel. But by stating that, one of the things that he did is he assumed that he had nothing to offer this pastor. In assuming that he's potentially communicating to that pastor that there isn't anything from the association or in the association or among the association that's going to serve that church well. He was about to potentially communicate that the only value that the church has for the association is as a resource value. He was potentially going to communicate that the association really isn't relevant for the larger or the missionally vibrant churches. And all of those things would have been potential disasters for him. However, oftentimes that's what we see happening. Whereas, as you guys have talked about, you have thoughtful questions in which you're bringing to the table as a means of asking questions that ultimately stimulate a leader to think beyond where they're currently at, and getting them to think, in terms of what could be, or the possibility of what are some areas that I need to work on. And so you're really stimulating them to another level of leadership. And so one of the things that we do as we work through the PRISM process, in this particular session, we focus in on really how to equip teams to ask better questions, and really to begin to sequence questions down in a very practical way in order to get them to help a pastor take their best next steps forward. And so this question sequencing, I'd like to think of it in terms of photography. So you see my giant camera here, which, we bought this in 2007. We bought this camera. And when we bought it, it was like state of the art. And now I think my iPhone camera is probably, takes better pictures than that. And then I have another camera here, as well. This little tiny camera is a, digital SLR, and it does video incredibly well at 4K. But I like to think in terms of a camera whenever I think about sequencing questions. And so on the sheets, I don't know if you guys have an opportunity to download the links that I sent. But on those sheets, and I changed it from the first email to the second email. So if you clicked on the first email, it's going to look a little bit different. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that link in the chat just in case. There we go. There's that link for that particular one. But sequencing these questions using what I like to call the telephoto technique, as far as the sequencing of questions go. So at first, whenever we begin to sequence questions, we're going to be equipping leaders to start with really a wide angle. And what we mean by, and the reason why we say a wide angle, is because we want to begin to ask broad questions that are really non-threatening, and yet they're questions that get the pastor talking meaningfully about the church, or about the situation that they're facing. We go through all of the introductory questions and, hey, how are you doing? But then we come down to now we need to get into some more details. And so we're going to be asking questions like, what is it you ask Steve, where are you seeing, or Steve Doyle, where are you seeing vitality and vibrancy in the life of your congregation? What are the areas that you see that God is leading, either in your congregation or in your life? And one of the questions that I love to ask, and if you've had a conversation with me, as we've talked about the prison process, you've heard me ask it. It's a Superman question. What would you do tomorrow if you knew that you would succeed, or if you knew that you could not fail? And that question right there is the question that I love to ask, because it gets a pastor or a leader beginning to dream and think in terms of, well, what would I do if I could not fail? And there's so many times that I've asked that question and they're like, I don't know, I need to sit here and think for a few minutes. And so these are the wide angle questions, asking really to get them thinking and talking meaningfully about a particular direction. What ends up happening a lot of times in you asking those wide angle questions, as I'm sure that you guys are familiar with, they begin to name some things that you sense are pain points in their ministry or pain points in their life. And so as you name those things, what I then encourage is to begin framing the subject. And so with a telephoto lens, you're zoomed all the way out and the subject's far in the distance. And so the first thing that you have to do is begin to frame that subject, and you zoom in on it. And when you frame the subject, what you're doing is you're beginning to ask pain based questions, really to help you discover what the pastor wants or challenges in their current situation. And so some of the ways in which we really hone in on those pain-based, questions is, what concerns you as you look towards the next 2 years? What's something that's keeping you up at night? What's going to be the long-term effect of that? What needs to be different a year from now? This goes to a little bit to Steve Allsbrook's question. 10 years from now, if I've heard you've messed up in ministry, where do you think that area is? And where do you need some stopgaps, some accountability to take place? And then the other pain-based question is, have you faced a similar situation in the past? Um, and so you're honing in on really some of their wants and their challenges that they're beginning to face, and they're centralizing in on those various things. At that point in time, as the camera zooms in, you frame the subject, you then begin to adjust the focus a little bit. And so adjusting the focus means that you're connecting the leader's emotions to the core problem. And the way in which I've found this effective is really by naming that emotion that they're expressing. Another way to put that is that you are, um, what's the word I'm looking for? You're naming emotions, and so you're categorizing emotions. So if you hear something in them that sounds like something they're excited about, something they're passionate about, something that gives them angst, you are naming that. And then you're asking a question about it. So it's something along the lines of, what? It sounds like that's something that's exciting for you. How did you develop a passion about that particular subject? What happened in your life that caused that particular thing to be such a passionate subject for you? Or it sounds like that's really frustrating to you. And you just state that and give them an opportunity to open up. And what ends up happening is they begin to open up more, because now you've named an emotion for them. And even if you've named their emotion incorrectly, they're going to correct your incorrect labeling of that emotion. And then they're going to go into greater detail, and they're going to further adjust the focus on what that core problem is, or that core issue or that next step is for them. The other thing that I like to do is I like to bring up, hey, earlier you mentioned this. That seems to be an issue that's of importance to you. How does that affect your daily work? How does that affect your daily life? It begins allowing them an opportunity to think in terms of that pain point that they're facing or that issue that they're going through, and how is it affecting them on a daily basis, or are they allowing it to affect them on a daily basis? And then I like to always do a summarization. Um, One of the leaders that I like to listen to is Guy, the CEO of the Black Swan Group. And his recommendation is you always want to get somebody to the statement of saying, that's right. Instead of it being yes, instead of it being no, you want to get them to the statement of, that's right. Because if they're saying that's right, that means that you've adequately echoed back to them their pain, their frustration, their core emotions or their core problem. Therefore, connecting with them, they feel connected to you because you understand them. And so, what I end up doing is summarizing, and then I end it with a question. So, it may be, so it sounds like this is what's going on in your life, and this is what's causing you this type of pain. And it's causing opportunities or issues over here and over here and over here. um, what sort of details have I missed? And I'm looking for them to say, that's right, because at that point in time, they're acknowledging that I understand them. They feel heard, they feel understood, and I've adequately adjusted the focus to the point to where they know that I am intently focused on them and care about what it is that they care about and their needs. And then the last thing that I step towards is snapping the picture. So you've got the wide angle, you frame the subject, they begin to express what's going good or what's struggling with or what their frustrations are or the things that are going on in their life, and you've adequately then adjusted the focus down and really focused in on what that thing is and gotten the details, and you've gotten them to that's right. And now it's the point that you need to snap the picture. And we snap the picture by asking questions like, what will happen if nothing changes? This essentially jolts them into thinking about the future and thinking, wow, I do need to address this problem. If you don't make this shift, what will your life be like 3 years from now? A lot of times we can tolerate things for only a certain period of time. But if we start to think about tolerating something for a 3 year period, it makes us like say, we have to address this now. We need to fix this. It's a problem that we need to address. Or how would you proceed? And this kind of goes back to that broad one, but instead it brings the picture of God leading them. How would you proceed if God were to guarantee success in where it is that you feel like He's leading you to step out in faith? Or if you know already this is something that you should do, what is stopping you from doing it? I asked that question to a leader the other day. I was on a phone call with, and he expressed, I know this is something that I should do, but tell me, why should I do it? And I just simply looked at him and I said, if this is something you know you should do, what's stopping you from do it? And why do I need to convince you? And he just was kind of flabbergasted. And he said, you know what? You're right. And so it was an opportunity for him to really see this is something I should do. This question sequencing is all about bringing greater value to the leader, regardless of their church size, regardless of their personal notoriety, because questions can allow us to really unearth things even in the most put together people, in the put together pastors, in the perfect type churches. And so it's important that we continue asking those questions. I'll never forget, I was meeting with a leading AMS. He is running one of the largest associations in the country, incredibly busy. I just happened to fool him into taking a 30-minute call with me. Normally, he doesn't take those calls. And by the end of the 30-minute phone call, he was like, "You have asked me so many hard questions, and it's really gotten me thinking." He said, "Thank you." And I was nervous to begin with because I thought, man, this is a very well known leader. But by simply asking questions, I was able to help him see things in a completely different way based on his circumstances and what he was going through. Before we step into the next segment, I'd like to ask, what are some of the questions that you like to ask as you drill down, or do you have sets of questions that you already drilled down on as you work with pastors? You seek to hone in on those things, or what do you like about this methodology of drilling down whenever it comes to question asking?
This sounds kind of simple, but I once had someone tell me, always follow up your question with the question, and what else? And tell me more,
Right,
because just as far as drilling down, because it's so often our pastors just want to stay on the surface, and so just by asking that question, I think makes them, makes them know I want more details. I want to know a little bit more about what's going on.
right, right. Yeah, yeah.
I'm making a note about that one, Steve.
And what else? That's good. What are some of the things that, and you guys are experienced guys, so this is what I'm going to ask you guys to tell me. What are some of the things that you need to keep in mind as a leader as you are asking questions to other pastors or to churches? Some of the things that you should avoid or to do in order to get better at asking questions.
I try not to ask closed questions. Obviously, they're just yes or no answers, but I would like to hear them put it into words, the answer, instead of just a yes or a no. And then um, you know, I think I don't know, yeah. I mean, that's one thing I could think of.
Hmm. That's good.
I guess the other thing that was on my mind was just not turning my questions into advice. Sometimes we can frame our advice or our recommendations, our suggestions to them in the form of a question. Have you ever considered doing this? Have you ever thought about trying to do? And I really want to avoid that
Right.
in my conversations,
Why is that?
because again, I'm coming at them as the expert, telling them how they need to operate, um, and instead of as someone who's there to walk alongside them.
Hmm. That's good. That's good.
I'm thinking about the dynamic when you turn the person into the teacher.
Mm,
Help me learn from you
mm,
how you do that, what you do, why you do. Um, the right now, the pastors who, for example, are going through or have gone through the transition to add online as a part of their worship experience.
mm,
I met with one of our pastors a few weeks ago. I just said, "Tell me how you all did that.
mm.
They didn't teach me any of this in seminary. I want to know how you all did that."
Yeah.
And it was really quite a good story.
Well, how do you think it made that pastor feel when you asked him that question?
Well, he was doing most of the talking. I was doing most of the listening. Uh, I wonder how often pastors actually get listened to.
Hmm.
Um, but I suspect that he appreciated my interest. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that Steve Doyle and I talked about last time was the aspect of, drawing from the strength of the cloud. You're essentially you're giving that pastor an opportunity to be an expert in something and explain
Mhm.
something that they've done, and it makes them feel good. And therefore, in making them feel good, they're more inclined after they felt good about an experience with the network to come back and have another conversation. Because he said, "Man, I felt good after that conversation with Steve. I really felt like I could just talk to him, and you created that space for that to happen." And so now he's going to come back and want to do it again. What other things? Anything else you should avoid doing?
I'll just add that as a person, so sometimes when I start a meeting with a group, for example, I will mention to them, I said, "You're a steward of your time, just like I'm a steward of mine."
Mhm.
And the idea of time as a particular personal value, I don't want to waste their time.
Right,
So I don't want to chase too many rabbits. If I need to do some rabbit chasing to build relationship, okay, but I want to stay focused on the purpose of our gathering.
right, right. Exactly. And some of the other encouragements that we often give is to avoid why questions.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
avoid why questions because why did you do that or why did you think that? Ultimately, it can make people feel as if they were wrong for thinking something. Um, maybe another way to put that is, that's interesting. What led you to that conclusion, or what led to that decision? Asking a calibrated how or what question instead of a why question. Um, the other one is to avoid interrogating with back to back questions. One of the most effective ways that I've found to get more information out of somebody without ever asking another question, but getting deeper into a subject matter, is by doing language mirroring, where I would summarize the three main ideas or three main words that they just said to me in the form of a curious tone. And I would just say something along the lines of, as they were talking, or they were talking about a particular situation, I'd just say, "So it was a problem, Deacon? So it was a struggling situation? So you were frustrated by that?" And by just simply doing that mirroring technique, all of a sudden they go into greater detail without me having to ask them about going into greater detail. The other one is, Steve Doyle kind of named it, avoid jumping to conclusions about what the answer is for their particular needs. Um, but ultimately, through asking these questions, you're able to discern what a leader's involvement really wants to be with you. And once you've really snapped that picture and they've answered the question about the future, um, a good follow up question is simply from the association, how can how can we best support you as you consider your next steps forward? Um, you've already named and drilled down to what that core thing is, maybe, and then it's simply a, how can we support you as you seek to do that thing? And they may ask for input or they may have an answer already. But either way, you've made progress for them from the associational standpoint. Um, but what we always encourage after those conversations is it's good to follow up the conversation by sending an invitation that names what it is that they unearthed, but as well as extends a further invitation for another opportunity to get together. Hey, I appreciate you opening up with me about that. I was so excited to be able to meet and talk to you and learn about those things. And then you name those emotions again. I just noticed how much I'll be praying specifically as you handle this and in this situation. Know that I'm here for you and am open for further communication about that. It opens that door up for the association. Um, Before we get into this last part, we only have about 10 minutes left. Um, are there any questions as you think about questions? I know that's a little bit tricky. Um, is this something that you feel like the association and the team members on the association, maybe that work with your churches, um, that they could use some better coaching and encouragement on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh, one of the surprises I have had in Richmond is the lack of curiosity by some of our field ministry staff people.
Hmm.
I'll give you an example. It was I read about in in a communication from our state about the mission offering. I read about a church in our association that's doing something, and I inquired of the person closest to them physically, geographically. I said, "Have you connected with them?" "No, I haven't done anything with them." And my question back is, what's it going to take for you to go knock on a door? I
Wow,
haven't asked them that yet, but uh, that I got the email back today. No, haven't done anything with them.
that's funny.
Oh, tragically funny. Yes, it is.
Yeah, tragically funny. It is one of those. Why do you think that there is a lack of curiosity?
I got several different ideas, but I really haven't worked with the people long enough to say for sure. Uh, some of the folks get set in their ways,
Mm,
just like long-term staff members in churches.
mhm,
Some of it has to do with whether or not they know how to go door to door and make a sale
mhm,
or are motivated to do that, which let me just say I've not seen any evidence of that,
mm.
that they do know that. I mean, I grew up as a kid going door to door selling flower seeds and newspapers and anything else I could, candy, whatever.
Right.
Um, so it's a combination of a lack of experience, a lack of motivation, set in their ways, coasting to the end, whatever it might be. Uh, I'm not exactly sure, but they are not as driven as I would hope
Mm,
or expect.
right. Steve, what about you? What do you think is the reason why people have a tendency to avoid asking questions?
I think a couple of things. One might be assuming they already know the answers, or they're assuming that they know everything and there's not really any questions to ask.
Mm,
Or on the flip side, maybe it might be the opposite of that. You're afraid to ask questions because they're afraid that I'm not going to be able to give any answers. I'm not going to be able to help if I ask too many questions, and they may ask me a question that I can't answer. So I think it can either be fear, or on the flip side, maybe a little bit of arrogance and pride.
yeah, yeah. And I agree with both of you on those things. Was somebody fixing to say something else?
Mm-mm.
I agree with both of you on those things. I wanted to end. One, I have a cheat sheet just for you or for your team or for anybody. I'm including it in the chat. And it's a simple cheat sheet, and most of these questions you're already asking. But for the associational staff or staff member that you know they have difficulty asking questions or even framing this type of conversation is difficult for them. Um, this can be a way to really help them and guide them as they seek to hone in, um, and asking questions and diving deeper into a conversation. As I mentioned, this is really just an introductory to this particular subject matter. We get into greater detail and we begin to talk about fruit issues and root issues and branch issues and identifying those and how do you ask a better question and what's the right question. And so we look at those things through the prism process. But um, in his book, the Book of Beautiful Questions, Warren, I think his last name is Berger, something like that. He makes the comment. He said there are a couple of things that keep us really from asking questions, and you guys have named them. It's fear. You're afraid of asking questions because you're afraid of the information that you'll get, or you're afraid that you may have to respond to something in a new way or think about something in a new way. Um, it's sometimes the knowledge. They have expertise and they rely too much of what they already know, and people fail to continue expanding that knowledge. I've learned more from asking questions of people than I've learned from reading books. And they felt better about the conversation when we got done simply because I asked questions. Sometimes it can be bias. There's a predisposition that keeps us from really desiring any more information. It's this thinking of, I know all the stuff that I know and I don't want to know anymore. Sometimes it's hubris, believing that our biases are correct, and they're not biases at all, but they're facts. And so we don't want to ask questions or be curious about something. Um, George Bullard, my mentor, one of the things that he always encourages, is, ask questions. Even if you disagree with the answers that somebody gives, you're learning something different, about a different perspective. And then the last one is time. A lot of times we don't ask questions because we don't want to take the time. And that's what we should be doing as we seek to support associational leader, as we seek to support, pastors and churches. It's it's time with them and seeking to help them take their best next steps.
Mhm.
Um, and so what my encouragement is for us to continue asking questions. I appreciate y'all being with me, today for this time. I want to value your time. So, do you have any other questions about questions, or any other questions about really, the prison process, or the next steps, or kind of how things are progressing?
Just to give you a heads up, the search committee is getting to they're at the interview stage now.